I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which means that we exist to make an impact rather than to make a profit. Our overall purpose is to reform the financial sector so that it serves society better. And we go about our work in many different ways to bring people together, to highlight the issues, to suggest responses to the problems, so on and so forth. And one of our most creative activities is running our TTF Film Club and our TTF Book Club. Of course, both are about giving a chance for people to discuss relevant movies, documentaries, and books. And today we have with us Joe Zamit-Lucia, who's going to be talking about his new book, all about the new political capitalism, which, as I understand it, is all about the intersection between business and finance and politics, and how this impacts the world of business and society at large. So, Joe, thank you very much indeed for providing your time today to help us run this session. Over to you, please, sir, to share your thoughts as you like to, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for inviting me, and welcome to everybody who's joined. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a few slides and talk to those slides for about 20 minutes or so, and thereby cover the main, if you like, points of the book and the narrative in the book, and then we'll throw it open to discussion and comment. So I'll just share my screen and hope it works. There we go. Can you all see that?
Perfectly well, Joe, thank you.
Perfect. So the book suggests that we've entered a new age, which I call political capitalism. And the question is how to be successful in this new age. And I'll go through what I mean by political capitalism. But I'd like, first of all, to share this little quote, which comes from Darwin, that it's not the most intellectual or the strongest of any species that survives, but the ones that are best able to adapt. So the question is, if you buy my thesis that we've entered a new phase of capitalism with a new shape, which businesses will be able to adapt and therefore be successful? And they won't necessarily be the biggest or the strongest businesses. So moving on, what I'll cover today is the broad social context, the role of business in that social context, and what all this means for corporate leadership. So let's start with that. So capitalism seems to have been the only real resilient approach to organizing our political economy. Why? Because, getting back to the Darwin quote, it's actually been extremely adaptable. So over the years, we've seen various forms of capitalism. We've seen, we've had feudal times, we've had mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, consumer capitalism, and the era that started coming to an end, in my view, in 2001, which is the era of financialized capitalism, where the only value that was two aspects of financialized capitalism. One is that our only measure of value became dollars or pounds or yen or whatever, but the only measure of value was money, and anything that we couldn't convert to money was not valued. And the second aspect of financialized capitalism is that much commercial activity started or was happening within the financial system itself. So instead of the financial system being there to be the lifeblood of broader economic and industrial development, it became an end in itself, and an increasing proportion of commercial activity was essentially the financial system trading with itself. And that's the era that is now, in my view, starting to come to an end. And the era of, hang on a moment. the era of the 21st century, in my view, is what I call political capitalism. So let's talk about that. What is political capitalism? Well, first of all, we have to have a common understanding of what we mean, or at least what I would like to mean by the word politics, because I know that many people and many business people have an allergy to the word politics. And every time it's mentioned, it sends a shiver down people's spine and says, oh my God, we don't want to get involved in that. But that's based on what I feel is a very narrow understanding of what the word politics means. So what I mean by politics is the mechanism by which we can make collective decisions about what sort of society we want to live in. That is what politics is about. You know, how do we want to organize ourselves? As individuals, we know what a good life might mean for us, but collectively, what sort of society do we want to live in? And that is what the political system provides. And there are various forms of political system, but they're all intended, or they all do provide that. And politics itself is a battle of ideas. So participants in the political process, and it's not just politicians, of course, as we shall see later, that participate in the political process, attempt to control the story. They control the narrative. And they do that largely by tapping into very deep-rooted values and beliefs, not by invoking objective self-interest. And we saw that, for better or for worse, and I won't take a side, for instance, during the Brexit debate in the UK, where the Remain campaign tried to invoke people's objective self-interest. Essentially, the Remain narrative was, you personally are going to be worse off if we leave the EU. The Leave campaign, on the other hand, tapped something much deeper. They tapped this sense of independence, this sense of self-control, this sense of the UK being master of its own destiny. All these are very, very fluffy concepts, very emotive and emotional concepts, but they managed to turn a deficit in the polls from before the referendum campaign to a victory in the referendum. So politics is about tapping these fundamental deep-rooted beliefs, you know, what people believe in, what people feel. It's not only, and maybe not even primarily, about invoking objective self-interest. And of course, there are many, many participants in what goes to create what we used to call, a term that has fallen out of favor, what we used to call the political economy. So obviously government has a big role, many roles in the political economy, but so does civil society, so do all of us as citizens, and so does private enterprise. Everybody impacts the eventual shape, everybody participates in the debate and impacts the eventual shape of our political economy. And the idea that many people in the private sector, many business leaders keep spouting that they are apolitical, that they have nothing to do with the political process, is simply abject nonsense. We all have a role to play in constructing this political economy, and business has a very big role to play. It employs people, it determines employment conditions, it lobbies government, it makes investments here or there, it fires people. It has a very, very big role to play in our political economy. So private enterprise is inherently political. And I describe business as part of the panoply of our political institutions, of which there are many. Let's start with some other principles. Lots of people talk about the free market. Well, there is no such thing as the free market because the markets are constructed. Markets can only operate within a set of rules. It's a little bit like a football game. You know, if you put, you can't play a football game unless it has a set of rules. If you put 22 players on a field and say, go play a game, and don't tell them what that game is or what the rules of that game are, they don't know what to do. So markets are not free, markets are constructed. They're constructed through a set of rules and a set of understandings. And it's the political process that sets those rules. So markets are political constructs. And businesses are political and social actors, not merely creators of shareholder value, as the age of financial capitalism has tried to teach us. And I put the word creators of shareholder value there in square brackets, because a part, and we can argue whether it's a small part or a significant part or an overwhelming part of the value, the financial value that is funneled to shareholders, is not actually created. It is simply taken from other parts of our political economy and shoveled into financial value for shareholders. So whenever a business pollutes, it is consuming environmental capital and converting that to financial capital that it feeds into shareholders. When a business makes 3,000 people redundant, it is consuming social capital and funneling that as financial value to shareholders. So that value is not created, it is simply shifted from one part of our political economy to another. So why are we moving into this era of political capitalism? Well, what we're finding is that the externalities, or to use a non-technical term, the bad things, the negative impacts on other parts of the economy of our financialized markets have become so visible and so large that we can no longer ignore them. We have divisions and inequalities of a society, in our society, that have come to bear directly on the structure of markets and the opportunities to run successful businesses. And businesses themselves are becoming increasingly reflexive about their political roles. And of course, we see that today in glorious technicolor with the tragedy that's going on in Ukraine, where businesses, simply cannot afford to keep doing business in Russia. They realize that they have a big political role to play by pulling out of that market in one way or another. And so and it's not only the big, huge things like the war in Ukraine, but it's other aspects, everything from diversity on boards down to operational issues, like whether you have gender neutral bathrooms. These are all political questions that businesses have become increasingly understand that they have to tackle. So all the conditions outlined above are in place today, which is why we're moving towards this era of political capitalism. We have rising inequality, climate change, all these things that you all know about, and I don't need to go into. We have political activism within companies themselves, and the citizens, us all as customers and citizens, are becoming increasingly politicized in the sense that we have views about the sort of society we want to live in. And those views are often very deeply and viscerally held and are being converted into our buying choices. So at the end of the day, there's a very much growing feeling out there that the structure of our political economy as it is, it's simply not working. And political ideas are starting to emerge as to how we fix that. And business is not immune to those political ideas. As Lord Haig put it, we've lived through a time through the 80s and 90s and maybe the very early part of this century, where the window of political ideas, what people sometimes call the Overton window, was actually very narrow. the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal idea of how to structure a society, had essentially won. In global terms, we believed that Western-style liberal democracy had won. There was nothing else to discuss, really. So the window of political ideas was very, very narrow. It was a bit of tweaking here and there. I mean, take the UK as an example. I could easily argue that the Blairite government was essentially continuity Thatcher, but with a bigger smile, because there really wasn't there weren't any radical revolutionary political ideas. Everybody fell into a relatively narrow window. So during that period, we could afford to put our emphasis on commercial success, on margins and growth. But now we know, and it's clear to everybody, that that window of political ideas has been blasted open. Who would have thought, if we were having this conversation in 1980, you would have thought me totally mad if I had said to you that the second biggest economy in the world would be ruled by an authoritarian government. It just was inconceivable at that time. So, now the global struggle for political ideas is back, and increasingly it will take priority over commercial considerations. I mean, again, let's take Brexit as an example. Brexit was a political idea. It's not a commercial idea, it was a political idea. And we all knew that there would be negative commercial consequences, at least in the short and medium term. And the long term, who knows? Still, that political idea won out in spite of the commercial consequences. So we're living in an era where it is political ideas that will drive movement, not what used to happen in the 80s and 90s, where it was commercial ideas because there wasn't really very broad political debate. And as a result, corporations are finding themselves under increasing influence from all sides, not just from governments, but from their own employees. We've heard of businesses that have been slow to pull out of Russia, meeting employee revolts and saying, we have to pull out. Civil society is much more active, much more investigative, creates much more transparency today than it ever did. So investors themselves now look at political issues, we might call them ESG, if you like, but essentially these are political ideas in how they make investments. Following Ukraine, the pattern of foreign direct investment is going to change dramatically because the calculus has changed. So everybody is putting pressure on corporations, influence corporations from all sides based on their political positions and political ideas. And we have some very explicit examples of this playing out over the last few years. Google, for instance, pulled out of a $10 billion contract with the US Department of Defense because its employees objected to its AI technology being used for defense purposes. Now, one may agree or disagree with that position. Doesn't matter, that's not the point here. The point here is that big commercial consequences due to employees' political positions. And the issue for Google in that situation was that it had not prepared itself. So it reacted to employee objections and pulled out of the contract. It didn't ahead of time have a political position as to whether it should be or should not be. So management was reduced to being reactive rather than proactive because they hadn't twigged, if you like, to the era of political capitalism. Microsoft similarly had to pull out of contracts with the US Immigration Department because its employees objected to President Trump's immigration policy. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, issued a memo to the employees, which started like this. And this is an explicitly political statement, which is, again, 20, 30 years ago would have been inconceivable for a CEO to send out a memo to employees, which is so explicitly political. HSBC is a British registered bank that does most of its business and generates most of its profits in China. And it had to sign, or at least it took the decision to sign the document that curtailed civil liberties in Hong Kong. Now, that is a very uncomfortable position to be in. And, its management still pretends that it can be apolitical. When questioned in the House of Commons about signing this document, the CEO of HSBC said that was not a political act. And he said, it's not my position to be political or moral, to make political or moral judgments. We know that such positions are no longer tenable. As some commentators have said, they can, Quinn, who's the CEO, can opine convincingly about staying out of politics, but it's not really that simple. Whereas the chairman spends 80% of his time on politics, not on business. So politics is now embedded in how companies have to run themselves, which is what I call the new age of political capitalism. For customers, and I hate the word consumer, by the way, because it sort of implies that the only value of a human being is how much he or she can consume. But customers say that for them, ethical drivers are three times more important to company trust than the competence of that company at delivering what it is. I mean, this is a new development. This was done in 2019. In 2016, in Australia, there was a fourfold increase in involuntary CEO exits for ESG issues, as opposed to for financial reasons. And according to PwC, in 2018, for the first time, CEO exits for non-financial reasons, which we can call political reasons, exceeded the exits for financial reasons, for financial non-performance. This is a new world. If we get to brands, by brands I mean product brands. We were talking so far about corporate brands, but if we get to product brands or corporate brands that are linked to their products, let's put it that way, they all handle their political meanings in different ways. Everybody's noticed that this is happening, but how they handle it, of course, varies. And there's a sort of a continuum from the banal to the core. So if we start with the banal, I use the example of M&Ms. So M&Ms have these cartoon characters, as some of you will have seen, and they've come out with a statement that these cartoon characters are now set to become more inclusive. And the first big change they made, which I'm sure has shaken the world, is this little green M&M female character here. You'll notice now has sneakers as shoes rather than high heels. This is the first big movement to make them inclusive. I mean, this is the kind of banal response that we get from some brands. Others have been accused of being opportunistic. So we all know that Nike has used Colin Kaepernick as its face for its campaign on Black Lives Matter. And, they've taken that position. When you take a political position like that, you please some people and you infuriate others. So you had many people who supported Nike and others who were burning Nike shoes in the streets. But, some people argued, well, this is not core to Nike. They've never been like that. They're just jumping on a bandwagon. So people were cynical about this. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I have no idea. But it was a reaction. For companies like Patagonia, environmental activism is embedded in their DNA. It was from day one the founding principle of Patagonia by Yvon Chouinard, who was an outdoor sportsman and loved the outdoors. So there's no question that they're opportunistic. If you look on their website, they don't say we're in business to create shareholder value. They don't even say we're in business to sell clothing. They say we're in business to save our home planet. And if you look at Patagonia and what they do and how they do it, I won't go into all the details here. It is embedded in every part of their business. And as a result, they've built a very strong, loyal customer base who believe in environmental activism. And Patagonia is growing at a rate much faster than most other clothing companies. Benetton decided to make political issues core to their promotional strategies. This is a picture of their campaign against the death sentence, but they've had many campaigns, campaigns for racial equality, campaigns for peace, campaigns for all sorts of things. And these campaigns were about the social issues. Their product was never ever mentioned. They just had their logo there in little green things, but they weren't selling product. They were selling a feeling of civic activism. And as such, they created a very edgy brand, very distinctive in a market of, high street clothing that is essentially a commodity market. And they differentiate themselves very, very strongly on the basis of their activism. So brands take different approaches, which is the beauty of pluralistic business. As a whole, we really have moved away from the post-war Washington consensus. The idea of globalized laissez-faire neoliberalism that we all believed and we all bought into is over. Whereas the Cornwall consensus following the G7 meeting in Cornwall last year, I guess it was, prioritizes a political action that moves very proactively to shape markets, to deliver a better political economy. Not the 1970s statism, where the state tries to control everything, nationalizes everything, tells everybody what to do. That was a failure too. But basically, there is a central role for politics and government as part of that in the construction of how markets work, which moves us on to what should regulation be about. There's a lot of regulation out there that is focused on stopping bad people doing bad things. It's a policing function. And we're stuck with that because there are always bad people doing bad things. But that's not really the primary role of regulation. The primary role of regulation is how do you construct markets in a way that they function well? And that is a political function. And all this raises the question, what is business for? We used to believe that business was there to make money. The 1980s, 1990s kind of viewpoint was that the purpose of business is to make money. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I used to work in the pharmaceutical business, I remember being in a meeting with R&D people and commercial people in the company. And the R&D people were presenting their ideas for what they could research and what products might emerge, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the commercial people halfway through got bored and stood up and said, look, this is all very fine and dandy, but you guys seem to have forgotten that we're here to make money. And the president of R&D responded, he was a wise old Scotsman, and said, laddie, we're not here to make money. We're here to make medicines that make people better. And if we do that well, then we'll make money. And that sort of common sense went out of the window in the 1980s and 90s. We started to believe that making money was the purpose of business, instead of making money being a consequence of business doing good things for people and for our society, making people's lives better and creating a better society. That is the role of business. And the businesses that do that well will make money. The danger, particularly with this focus on ESG, is that it all becomes a veneer, that we keep focused on the idea that business is there to make money and the only things that matter are your quarterly results, that all these ESG ideas changes from being something that is actually quite fundamental to business purpose and business strategy to becoming a tick box exercise. And there is, of course, a huge industry out there that's come up trying to turn ESG into exactly a tick box exercise because that's how they make money. So it becomes thoughtless. So for instance, I'll give you another anecdote. I was recently giving a talk at a business school, and the person who was speaking before me came from an investment house, and she was proudly telling us about their ESG metrics and how they use them. And she said they use the MSCI metrics and proudly said that therefore they invest in Burberry because Burberry scores high on the MSCI metrics. So my question to her was, Burberry is a fashion company. The core of its business is products obsolescence and waste. How can a company that the core of its business is product obsolescence and waste possibly score high on ESG metrics because they've reduced their chemical use by 10%? It doesn't make any sense. So the danger is in this ESG world is that it'll be business as usual, but with a pretty ESG hat on it. And that's something that we need to guard against. And as Jan Fraser, CEO of Citi, said on her first day as CEO, that you can't have ESG as a separate layer that sit above what we do day to day. So what does this mean for companies? Well, in the era of 20th century financialized capitalism, this is how business leaders tended to be pushed into seeing the world. You start from the inside out. So the first thing you think about is, what's my financial performance and how's my stock price doing? Then you say, how do I make my organization better so that I deliver a better financial performance and a better stock price performance? And then you say, and how do I make sure that somehow that fits with contemporary culture and what people want? It was an inside out perspective. The successful companies of the coming decades will start looking at themselves from the outside in. They start by saying, what's contemporary culture like? What kind of society are we trying to build here? And what sort of organization do I therefore have to build to contribute to that, to make a positive contribution? And then they say, and how do I do that in a way that is profitable and sustainable? So you start from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And if you start that way, you end up in it may seem simple on a little chart like this on a PowerPoint slide, but in fact, you end up in fundamentally different places. And this is, how things evolve. On the bottom axis here, these issues are, first of all, latent. So in the early part of this century, at the turn of the century, these issues started coming up, but they were really quite hidden. Then they start to emerge, then they mature, and then they become institutionalized. So, when they're latent, business responds by saying, well, that's just how it is. It's none of my business. Then we go the other way and say, business has to fix this. Well, of course, business can't fix everything. And then we sort of move to the institutionalized phase where we all agree what we need is regulatory solutions. And by regulatory solutions, again, I don't mean the policing type, but we need ways of we need to find ways of how to structure these markets in a way that works. And the competitive response also moves. First, it becomes defensive. That's nothing to do with me. Then it becomes simply compliance. Okay, I'll pollute a little bit less. Okay, I'll tick the ESG boxes. Okay, I'll comply with what you tell me to do. Then there are some first movers who say the world is changing, and I can exploit that if I'm faster to move than my competitors. And finally, you get to the collaborative phase where public policy and business activity is starting to move in the same direction. We're not there yet, but I think that's where we'll get to. And some businesses will try and sort of live on the boundary between risk and opportunity, not move too fast, not move too slow. Others will be slow and fall into the risk zone, and others will be faster and find opportunities as to how they can be more competitive. So that's what I wanted to cover. The social context has changed, and although Ukraine has slapped us in the face with it, this is something that's been going on since the beginning, since the turn of the century. I would argue that 2001 and 9/11 was the first episode that started this process at a geopolitical level and at a national political level. Second is the role of business is increasingly to become reflexive about that they do have a political role. The idea that certainly I used to be hammered down my throat when I was in multinational businesses in my youth, that politics has nothing to do with us. If only politics could keep out of my way, I can get on with the business of doing business. That's over, and increasingly businesses are more reflexive that they have a political role. And what does it mean for corporate leadership? Well, as always, different businesses, different business leaders will react in different ways, and we'll just see how it plays out. I'll stop there, if I may, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. That was extremely interesting. Very, very grateful to you for sharing your thoughts about your book. There is so much to discuss. There really is so much to discuss. And you're quite right, of course, to make reference to what's happening in Ukraine. My personal view is that amongst many other lessons for the world, Ukraine will be showing us how wrong it is to allow commercial interests, for example, around the whole dirty money topic, to get in the way of taking the right action by leaders around the world to have, managed Putin in a far more robust way over the last decade or so. We've got some great guests here. We've got various people who I'm sure will be keen to interact with you and share their thoughts about what you've been explaining, and of course to also pose some questions as well. I'm going to try to quite lightly facilitate the conversation we're about to have. Let's make it as much like a family discussing a matter over the kitchen table. That's how we like to run these sessions. Can I please, first of all, ask you a question myself, Joe, and then we'll go to others that would like to step forward. So you spoke about the lady at Patagonia, and you talked about her passion for the subjects that Patagonia is now quite well known for. So I just want to start off with a relatively straightforward question, which is, to what extent in reality does the personality or the character of an organization reflect very simply the personality or the character of the leader? And if there is a strong correlation, if we want to make the world a better place, what can we do to accelerate the evangelism, if you like, of leaders of corporates around the world? Let's kick off with that one. Thank you.
Okay, so Yves Chouinard was a guy. I just want to
forgive me.
Not a lady, just to start there.
Yeah.
And Patagonia is a successful company, but it's not a huge company. Let's be clear. And it was founded on these principles. So clearly, when a company is founded, it tends to take on the personality of the founder, and particularly if the founder remains significantly involved. As companies grow, of course, that might change. So, none of us remember who founded Boeing, or who founded, Barclays Bank or whatever. So there's a difference, I think, between a company that is founded on certain principles and manages to maintain those principles, a company that is founded on certain principles, like many of the Quaker companies, for instance, like Cadbury's, that then change over time, get acquired and reacquired and reacquired, and essentially lose their identity and become something else. And companies that are well established and have an embedded current culture. And changing that is a very different task from founding a new company. So we see in your field, for instance, we see a lot of new startup fintech companies being founded on certain principles. But that's a much easier thing to do than turning around the culture of a huge global bank. So it's horses for courses, I think. Regarding business leadership, of course, leadership has an important role to play, but leadership does come from various sources. So as we saw in the Google and Microsoft examples, leadership actually came from the employees. And the leaders were the senior management, I won't call them the leaders, the senior management were reactive. So, leadership comes from various places. Now, when I was discussing the book with a banker friend of mine in the US, he asked me a question, and he said, do you think that people who are currently at the top of big corporations, who were formed in the 80s and 90s in terms of their way of thinking, are actually capable of changing? Or are we going to have to wait for a new generation of leaders to come on to help drive that change? Of course, there is no answer to that question because different people are different. So some of them will and some of them won't. Some of them will take the view, let's keep the ship steady and business as usual at least until I retire. And then it's somebody else's problem. Others, and we've had people like Paul Polman and others who have tried to turn big ships around. And we know, and we have seen just how difficult a process that is, and how some of these leaders have ended up losing their job because we're in a transitional period. So it's very hard to navigate that change.
Joe, thank you very, very much. I really enjoy the energy and the positivity. I think you have a remarkably upbeat view of the way that organisations are actually following. It's excellent. Thank you. Let's go to our guest today. So please just raise your hand, either digitally or literally, to put a question or to make a point. Let's go straight to Sunil. Sunil, you're on mute. Please take a moment, Sunil, first of all, to introduce yourself and give some context, then, of course, dive into your point. Thank you, Sunil.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks very much for a very, very nice presentation, Joe. Joe and I are together at the Council of Economic Policies in Zurich. I'm associated with the George Washington University as a visiting scholar. And before that, I spent many years working at the IMF, and before that, in an earlier career, teaching at the University of California. So, Joe, my question is that if you think about the last 4 decades, you would think that it was really, in some sense, the balance between state and private sector that got transformed, say, with post 1980, with, in some sense, we tried to shift away from a state which was, in some sense, trying to do too much, to a philosophy that somehow, as what you say, free markets will take care of things. And you're absolutely right to think that there are no free markets. Markets require rules. They are actually institutions, and I don't know of any examples where you have a dysfunctional state but you have thriving markets. So it in some sense it's a co-partnership that has to evolve. Um, so to me is the two things that have happened, the two systemic shocks that we have seen. First, the global financial crisis, which was a huge systemic shock, which in some sense got us rethinking about the capitalism that we had created. And the second systemic shock is the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I might add here the third shock, which is in some sense we are part of, and in the Anthropocene, which is the climate shock. Mm-hmm. I mean, given that in the last 2 decades, really, but as we've these 3 huge shocks should have shaken our faith that the system that we had designed would somehow get back into business as usual equilibrium. So I mean, the question is, how do you convey that to the average citizen, that change is required, in the way we produce things, in the way we consume things, in the way we organize our society? How do you communicate that more effectively? Because obviously we haven't been very effective at doing that till now.
Yes. So thanks, Sunil. Nice to see you. Good question. So, in the 60s and 70s, we had the statist idea that for things to work, the state had to run everything. So everything was nationalized, blah, blah, blah. And that fell apart. And then, as you rightly described, we went into the 80s and 90s, and markets were going to look after everything. It was kind of a pendulum swing, if you like, from one extreme to the other. And, my conception is that when 9/11 happened, the geopolitical plates started to shift. And people started asking lots of questions. Then, as you rightly say, we got the global financial crash, we've got increasing inequality, we've got climate change, then we got the pandemic. So all these things build upon each other. So, you ask the question, how do you convey that? How do you convey the need for change to citizens? Personally, I don't think we need to do that. I think citizens feel in their bones that the system isn't working. First of all, because it isn't working for them individually, but they can all see that the system isn't working. The flip side of that, of course, or at least not the flip side, the moderating effect of that is that the word change is the word in the English language or in any language that creates the most anxiety among people. So it's change is frightening for a lot of people. But I think it depends on how we look at the process of change. So let me give you another anecdote. There's a CEO of a large company that I used to advise, and we used to meet every 2 or 3 months and just chew the fat. And I used to tell him, your business model is utterly broken. And one day he walks in and he says, and I say the same, we start the same conversation, and he says, look, we've had this conversation many times. I said, yes. He said, and you'll also notice that nothing has changed here. I said, yes, I've noticed that too. He said, my problem is this. He said, I know my business model is broken, but I don't know what the new one looks like. So I don't know what to do. Now, that is a very human reaction, but it betrays a misunderstanding of the process of change. So a lot of people, particularly in kind of the elite layer, believe that change happens when 6 bright people sit in a room and devise a new system and then implement that. It's a kind of engineering approach to social change. Well, that's not how change happens. Change emerges. It's an emergent process out of many people doing many different things. And over time, a different system evolves and emerges, just like the process of evolution. So the question that the CEO I mentioned should have asked is not what is the new system so that I can write it down and then tell people what to do. The question he should have asked is, have I created an organization where people have enough freedom to challenge so that a new model will somehow emerge? And I think that's what we're seeing now in our societies, our financial systems, our business systems, our political systems. People know that it's broken. People know it's not working. Nobody knows what the new system should look like, except I would argue it's going to be more political, but in what shape or form, nobody knows. But I think there is enough activity out there that is substantially different from what went on before, that a new system will eventually emerge. But we can't write it down. We can't design it like an engineer would design a machine, because social systems are not machines. They will emerge. And progress, again, you know, business people and many of us brought up in kind of a scientific, narrow way of thinking, think of progress as a straight line between place A and place B. So you start at place A, you know where place B is, you draw the most efficient route between the two and you go. Well, that's not how social change happens. Social change is more like a sailing boat in rough seas, where the captain or whoever has to tack this way and that, depending on the prevailing political winds in this case, but depending on the, you know, they hit waves and get pushed back a little bit. They take on water and have to throw it out. They know broadly the general direction they have to go to, but not quite how they're going to get there in these rough seas. That's how social change happens. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of energy, a lot of fizzing of new ideas, a lot of people wanting to do things differently. And I'm confident that out of that, something new will emerge, but I have no idea what it'll look like.
Wow. Wow, very interesting indeed. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sunil. Thank you very much. Cliff, what thoughts, questions, comments would you like to share, sir? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. First of all, thanks for a brilliant presentation, and I can't wait for the recording because I want to share it with my team, our social license holders, and also our network of shared wealth social enterprises. A lot of it resonated, the feeling that there's a change going on. I think we're very aware of it. I particularly like the idea that it's sort of coming from the outside inwards, because we feel that we're an organization that's changing in response to it. But as you say, we're not 100% sure what it is that's changing or why. And sometimes we wake up and find ourselves, what are we doing? We were a social enterprise. We were supposed to be in the social economic sector. How is it that practically everyone we're working with is in the private sector? How am I having meetings with Anglo-American mining? How am I talking to people from the corporate sector who are calling themselves social capitalists? You know, they're groping for names. And also, you know, looking at how our organization works, I think the COVID thing has changed things forever, how we make decision making. You know, people work where they work. The company has 12 or 14 different ways of communicating. There is a growing division between ownership and a fluid decision making, which means that the old ideas of, you know, one person, one vote is redundant. I don't know where that leaves the cooperative movement. So we know all this is happening, and we're trying to embrace it because we have a feeling that this is all playing to our strengths. But I quite like the idea that, you know, we're we're trying to embrace that change and work with it, but we have no idea where we're going. But certainly the group of shared world social enterprises, I was quite interested in that, because they are very much into the ethics and very much into sharing wealth. The whole concept of social impact and social purpose, actually, it's not that important to them. It's more of a consequence. And yet, there's a focus on sort of measuring social impact. But actually, these companies aren't interested in measuring that. They're interested in the ethics, and also they are convinced that they have the better business model. They have the better business model because they have motivated workers, they have loyal customers, and they have insensitive, I can never say that, insensitive investors. And therefore they are, they have the sense that they don't, they know they are the better business model, and they say that because of that, they are reducing the risk. With ethics and sharing wealth reduce the risk, and I can see that they are more protected against the sort of political buffers as well as the fact that they're just more efficient. So a lot of it resonated, and it does feel like we're on a journey, and it does feel like you are a co-journeyman to us. So I can't wait to share this video. Thanks so much, Andy, for organising this.
Welcome. Joe, your reflections on what Cliff has been setting out there.
Yes, before I do that, if I may, Cliff, there's a thing in the chat from Mike McGrath, who has to leave soon. So I'd like to address some of his questions before he leaves, and I'll also put them later in the chat. But he's sort of talks about greed is bad, as opposed to the greed is good idea of the 80s. So I like to say greed is human. And we don't live in financial systems. We don't live in engineered systems. We lived in human systems, and we have to accept the nature of human beings and the nature of different human beings. So it is in the nature of human beings to be greedy, and some more than others. And then he talks about rules that have been implemented and why they were, financial institutions have no rules. Well, they do have rules. Whether they're appropriate rules or not, I don't know. He talks about the overdrafts, etc. The reality is that the rules of the game at any one time reflect the spirit of the time. In fact, I'd go further and I would say the rules of the game, because the political and regulatory process is very slow, the rules of the game reflect the spirit of the previous decade, because it takes a long time to move through the process. So the rules governing the financial system, which is close to your heart, Andy, still reflect to a large extent the spirit of the 80s and 90s. And that's not bad or good, it just is. The rules that we make are the rules that we believe are the best rules, depending on how we happen to be seeing the world today. By the time those rules get implemented, get actually passed, then get implemented, then everybody tries to find a way around them, and they do. It's kind of, 10 and 15 years have passed and the world has changed. So let's kind of be realistic. Rules are set, they're always out of date, they are always imperfect, they always have unintended consequences, and they always generate an industry that tries to find its way around them. So there is the first thing we need to understand is that there is a limit to what we can achieve through rules. Progress is not achieved through rules. Progress is achieved through a change in culture, where people behave in a different way because otherwise their neighbor looks down their nose at them. That's what changes. That's what drives progress. a change in culture. The rules are a part of that and reflect that with substantial delay, but it's not what changes people's behavior. It's peer pressure, it's how culture changes. And I don't think anybody, well, maybe, I don't know, I would never say anybody, but I think that most people, or many people at least, would agree with the idea that today we live in a quite different set, with a quite different set of cultural expectations than the 80s and 90s. So change will inevitably follow, but it'll be messy and it'll be imperfect, and it'll be, somewhat chaotic. That's just how it is. So let's not put too much faith in the rules. They're essential, and we should do our best, and we should try and influence them, while realizing their substantial limitations.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to cut in again, if I may, please, Joe. So, as you know, the Transparency Task Force has a particular interest in the workings of the financial sector and trying to improve the way the financial sector works. One of the conclusions that I've come to over the years is that the financial industry doesn't serve society the way that it ought to, because the rules of the game that are played are produced by regulators who are to some degree or another captured by the City of London in the UK context here. And when I think about what is it that's driving the capture of the regulators, I think about the Treasury, and I think about the big banks and the massive lobbying powers of those sorts of organizations. And I then say to myself that, you know what, the problem here is to do with our democracy. We don't yet have a vivid, dynamic democracy that truly reflects the will of the people. And you spoke earlier, Joe, and it was a great point. You spoke earlier about the, let's say, 10, 15-year time lag between the zeitgeist leading to a better, a better framework. So I'm coming round to thinking that the apex problem here is the apex problem the fact that our democracy needs sorting out, that it's not really as dynamic or truly reflective or truly as responsive as it ought to be. And because of that, we have a democracy that is kind of skewed away from what it should be. And that then manifests in organizations not behaving in the kind of ESG orientated way that we would want them to, whether that's financial services or pharmaceuticals or any industry. There's this tension between what should really be going on and what's going on as a consequence of this kind of skewed or slightly corrupted with a small c democracy that we have. Please do speak to that if you wish to.
Sure. Before I do, let me pick up on Cliff's points, because we kind of skipped his comments. And what Cliff described to me was, I came across to me as, very encouraging. The fact that, what you're trying, well, first of all, what you're trying to do, all power to your elbow. And secondly, that you're finding yourself engaging with the sorts of corporations that, 5 minutes ago, many people would have labeled as evil. So I think all that is very, very positive. Getting back to Andy's question about, let's maintain a sense of proportion. Okay, many people around the world would kill, and in fact do, to have the sort of democracy and institutional structures that we have in the UK and that we have across Europe. Okay, so let's maintain a sense of proportion here before starting to say that our democracy is totally broken. It isn't. Okay, it works by and large. It's imperfect, but every democratic structure is imperfect. You can look at how they organize themselves in Germany. You can look at how they organize themselves in France, in the US, whatever. None of it is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, which imperfections do you want? That's the question we should be asking ourselves, not how do we make it perfect, because that leads you to la la land, which doesn't exist. So the question is, which imperfections do we want? And you make your choices. Now, by and large, our democracy works. Okay, it's imperfect in many ways, and we can try and plug those imperfections, but these things tend to be a little bit like a balloon. You know, you press one end and it comes out the other. It's not really easy to define. So we try and do better. And again, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I hope, not 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But you know, by and large, you know, we have a structure that, you know, ensures, so far has ensured the peaceful transfer of power every 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have, you know, fairly good transparency in our governance structures, not perfect and not fully transparent, but we can debate whether it should be fully transparent. We have a very vibrant civil society. We have organizations like yours who can challenge the system and not be thrown in jail for doing so. Okay, so you know, we're doing well. Now, let's talk about this issue of government capture, as people call it. And I would make 2 points there. One is everybody, you know, the beauty of democratic pluralism is that everybody is allowed to have their own perspective. Mm-hmm. So what you expressed is your perspective, and that's great. And you're entitled to it, and you should push for it. But it is not the only perspective, and it's not necessarily the truth or the right perspective, okay? That is something that we have to have a debate about. So there will be some people who fundamentally disagree with what you say, and they need to be heard too, and we need to discuss that. Now, about this issue of government capture, I think it's a very difficult one, because government has 2 roles, 2 important roles that pull it to some extent in opposite directions. So government has to stimulate the economy, has to make sure that its citizens have a decent standard of living. And one of the ways it does that is to encourage business and to encourage business success and to create the conditions in which businesses, including the financial services sector, can be successful. Okay, that's one role of government. The other role of government is to hold those very businesses to account and to not let them get away with things that they shouldn't get away with. And finding that balance is what good governance is about, but it isn't easy. And it won't be perfect. And, you know, sometimes it'll err on one side and, you know, too much rope will be given to businesses and they'll do things which we maybe don't like. And the other, and under a different administration, it might go the other way. And, you know, the noose gets tightened too hard and businesses get stifled. So, you know, finding that balance is a challenge. Now, you know, in some areas, I mean, I think that the financial sector, I would be one of the people who would tend to agree with you that the financial sector is not necessarily fulfilling its role as best it could. That, you know, in the London stock market now, last year, I think there was more money taken out of industry into the financial sector through dividends, share buybacks, acquisitions, etc., etc. There was more money taken out of industry into the financial sector than money put in from the financial sector into industry to help it develop. Wow. Okay, so that is not what finance is supposed to do. That's not what our understanding of the role of finance is. But why are we here? The reason we're here is because we are just coming to what I hope is the tail end of the era of financialized capitalism. And financialized capitalism is exactly about that. Financialized capitalism is about essentially the finance sector being an extractive industry that extracts wealth out of industrial production and services production or whatever, and shifts it in a financial way, first of all to itself as the intermediary, and then to the stockholders and all the people who are playing around with financial instruments. So yes, I think we are in that position, and that is the legacy of the era of financialized capitalism. But I think it's starting to come to an end, because you're not the only one, and we're not the only ones saying this isn't working.
Yeah.
Now, how to achieve that change, how to achieve a culture change, a behavioral change, and then a rules change, you know, not in that order necessarily, but, you know, if you see what I mean, how to achieve all that without falling flat on your face and, you know, destroying the industry is not easy. And that is the balance, I think, that everybody's trying to find. And I think any positive contributions to how we make, you know, slow, one foot in front of the other steps to move in that direction, I think are very positive. And they're needed, because nobody knows how to do it. So any good ideas, I'm sure, will be welcomed by many people. But it's as well to recognize the, you know, why we are where we are, that things are changing, and that change is not easy, and that, you know, labeling people bad people because they've done what was expected of them at the time is not necessarily helpful.
Thank you, Joe. That was a really, really insightful response. You always leave me with a lot to think about. You really do. And you actually get me to, I find myself changing my position on things and feeling a little bit more, I say to myself, Andy, maybe I should be a bit more patient with the world than I tend to be.
Well, before you get a bit more patient, let me also add that the extreme, utterly unreasonable, militant activist is also an important part of our democracy. So however irritating we might find those people from time to time, we have to have them.
Yeah, they shake things up. Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. Could I invite any of our other guests here today to raise their hand and put a point or pose a question to Joe if you'd like to? Rebecca, was that you putting your hand up, or was that, I think you're just...
It is.
It is. Oh,
it was
there we
meant
go.
to be.
You put your clappy up there instead of your hands up. Go for Rebecca. Please take a moment, Rebecca, just to first of all introduce yourself and explain the background and the context of the work that you do. I know very well, but not everybody else on the meeting does. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And apologies, I arrived slightly late today. I have my French class today, so I was practicing my language.
Tremendous.
But I will look forward to listening back to the recording once it's available in full. So thank you. And by way of introduction, so I'm from the UK. I'm based in the Netherlands. I work in the field of sustainable finance and have done many financial institutions for about 10 years, been about 20 years in finance as a whole, now working for a B corporation and supporting financial institutions on that journey. And I'll maybe leave it there. There's probably lots more I could say, but just to leave it there for introductory purposes. And maybe a few thoughts just reacting to what I've heard so far. And thank you so much. It's such a relevant topic at the moment. Firstly, just taking two organisations I've worked with, one very large bank and one B Corp, both of them, for different reasons, didn't particularly get interested in politics. One with the bank because they said, we're a guest in the country, it's not our role to be involved, we're neutral. The other with the B Corp just said, it's absolutely not worth dealing with the politicians, they're not going to change, we waste our time, we're going to focus on private business. So I just found it interesting that for very different reasons there was this reaction. So that was sort of one comment. And then Andy, I think the point on democracy is something I really worry about as organizations do become more political, which inevitably they're getting pulled into doing, usually as a result of social media. So it's not their choice, but it's because people are asking them to opine on things or they're having campaigns. But that link with democracy is something I really worry about because particularly with younger generations, I'm finding that there's almost this reliance, oh, the private sector will do it. Oh, it's fine, we'll just talk to the companies. It's for the companies to step in. And I think, oh, hang on a sec, voters as well. And there's such an apathy. And as soon as and this is a generalization, but as soon as I start talking about politics and which political parties we each vote for and so on, in a very sensitive way, people kind of go, oh, no, not interested. Doesn't concern me, don't bother. Waste of time, cynical. And then that starts to, I think, influence culture, and because it really makes me very nervous that there's this apathy and cynicism, and particularly when it's from younger people.
Just before we go to Joe on that, I mean, I'm reflecting on my own kids. I've got a 27-year-old, 25-year-old, and a 15-year-old shortly to become 16, and they really do see politics as like a completely distant, out of touch, nebulous lump in society that doesn't do any good. I mean, they are genuinely very, very disengaged and very, very skeptical. So I echo what you're saying. Joe, what do you think?
So, hi, Rebecca. I hope you're enjoying the Netherlands. I've just been living in Amsterdam for the last 8 years and have just moved back to London. So our paths did cross there and crossing now. So there's something. So let's get to this. Let's get to the nub of this issue of politics. It is not true that people don't care about politics. Okay, they say that, but how many times have you been to a dinner party where people say, please, let's not talk politics? And the reason they say that is not because people don't care, but because people care too much. Because if you start talking about politics, everybody starts getting angry with each other. Okay, so it's simply not true that people don't care about politics. We should expunge that idea from our mind. And if anybody says it, please give them the response that I've just given you. So, it is untrue. Second, you said that you joined a little bit late, and early on in what I was presenting, I presented my definition of politics. Okay, because most people only focus on the process of politics, the political process, elections, electioneering, political parties promising everything, the kind of political parties fighting amongst each other, all that. That is what people think about when you say politics, okay? But that is simply the imperfect process of deciding our political governance. That is not politics. Politics, as I mentioned earlier, is the process by which we collectively decide what sort of society we want to live in. And it is not just the politicians who are involved in politics. Okay, Greenpeace is involved in politics. Okay, Greta Thunberg is involved in politics. Whoever is fighting for women's rights is involved in politics. We are all in one way. Andy is involved in politics because he's trying to change, the rules of the financial sector, and that's a political process. Okay, you are involved in politics because you're trying to help companies do things in a way that benefits in your what some believe is a greater benefit to society. Okay, so politics is that process by which we collectively work out in a very messy, chaotic, imperfect way, because that's what democracy is, how we're going to live together. That's politics. And if you read Bernard Crick's, which I suggest everybody should do, you read Bernard Crick's seminal work In Defense of Politics, which is a very small book that you can read in a day. He describes politics as a civilizing activity. Without politics, it's the law of the jungle. You know, how many of us want to go and live in those states that have no governance? How many of us are moving to Libya because they essentially don't have any governance anymore? They don't have any governance. It's fallen apart. So before we criticize our system, let's kind of be careful. And before we criticize politicians who have a job to do that is infinitely more difficult than anybody running any business, let us just swallow a little bit of humility. You know, we have never tried to do that impossible job. And it's become a sport among all of us to criticize politicians. I find it offensive. So I want to respond to you about apathy, and the reason what you call apathy, first of all, is not true, because people do care about political issues. They get irritated by the messy, imperfect, sometimes seemingly corrupt political process, but that's kind of by the by in the greater scheme of things. And then you mentioned, if I remember correctly, that people are worried about businesses becoming more political because they maybe can exercise more power. But today we live in a different age from the 1970s. You know, you may be too young, but not too young in general, but too young to remember the days of the smoke-filled rooms, you know, when government and business and trade unions got together, you know, everybody's smoking their cigars, their cigarettes, or their pipes, and they did a deal. And it was often, you know, to the detriment of the public, but in their own interests. But those days are over. You know, today we have much more transparency. We have a huge number of political actors. We have NGOs coming out of our ears, investigating this, investigating that, showing things up. We have protected whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork every day. We have social media that has given voice, with all its faults and all its problems, it has given voice to millions of people that didn't have a voice before. The world is a very different place. The exercise of concentrated power is becoming ever more difficult unless you're Putin or President Xi. Okay? But thankfully, and we should be thankful, we don't live under those regimes. And we should celebrate that rather than saying that our democracy is crap. So you know, I think in these days, the concentration of power is becoming ever more difficult. And we should celebrate that and encourage that. Now, of course, there are faults. So in my view, the competition authorities, for instance, have been asleep at the wheel for the last 20 years and have allowed far too much concentration in certain sectors. But, you know, okay, that's an imperfection, and we should hold them to account to that and take them to task. And things are starting to change because eventually people notice. So in response to your overall question, everyone is interested in politics at a visceral level, because everyone is interested in the kind of society we live in. Now, yes, people find irritating, sometimes repulsive even, the mechanics of the political process. And we should try and improve that. But that's not what politics is. That is just a few cogs in the wheel of the bigger picture of what politics is. And I would make an appeal that we find a different sport to amuse ourselves than constantly criticizing politicians who have an impossible job to do.
Joe, you're far more lenient than I am. You really are. You really
Me too.
Well, you know, if you don't believe me, go and sit in their chair. Go stand
Well,
go stand
you know,
for
I'm
office.
thinking about it.
Okay, off you
Seriously.
go.
Well, that's
That would be
good.
great. Go
That's
stand
good.
for office. Cliff.
That's good.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a small point. I totally agree with your point, but just like to add an observation that we've had, because we do an awful lot of work with schools, and we've been struck that there's coming up a generation of young people, and they're sort of like, I don't know, 12 and 14 and a bit younger, who appear to be, I think it's the environmental issue, much more radical, much more full of energy, and much more wanting change than the generation above them. And that's a feedback that we're getting from schools, mainly in the UK, but also in Europe as well. And it's something that we've been commenting on. They've actually quite surprised us by their energy and what they're saying as well. Yeah.
Yes. In fact, they are politicized.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that. Yes.
So it doesn't fit in with the idea that young people don't care about politics. Young people are much more politicized than my generation, because we've lived through this golden age where, you know, everything seemed to be all right. We had no wars. You know, we were becoming richer every day. You could buy a house when you were 20. You were assured of a good retirement. You know, we've lived through this golden age where who cared about these political issues? You know, everybody was fine. But you know, the new generation, what it looks like, I mean, none of us know, but what it looks like are not going to be living through a similar age. I think our age, if you like, was an aberration. In the long sweep of history, the age we lived through was a total aberration.
Wow. Once again, you're giving us so much to think about, Joe. You really are. Well, we're going to be wrapping up in about 5 minutes or so, folks. Who else would like to come in with any further thoughts or questions for Joe? It's been such an interesting conversation. For me personally, this is the first event we've had for a long, long time where we haven't been kind of focused on financial services, financial regulation, etc., etc. It's been quite, you know, macro in its scope. It's been very, very enjoyable, actually. It's been very enjoyable. Would anybody else like to come in at this point? Sunil, please do. Thank you, Sunil.
So Joe, a very general question. I mean, I agree with you. I have a similar perspective that it's a complex evolutionary process. We don't know, you know, what the emergent, for want of a better word, equilibrium will look like. I think the issue is that when you think of the political process, which is determined by culture, institutions, distribution of power, the question is, how can we create a particular kind of collective agency which will help us emerge to a better equilibrium socially than we currently have, right? And as others have also pointed out, if you take the scientists seriously, we're running out of time. And we may not have the luxury of saying that we will wait for positive contagion, which will change human behavior, and then hence we will you know, come to a better equilibrium. The question is that there is a sense, and I think we can see that in the younger generation, that the older generation is not taking these problems and what is emerging more seriously. And the question is, how do you change the collective agency and make this happen? That was my, you know, even when I was talking about the balance between state and private, the corporations and the citizen, there is still something to be done. And the question is, how do we do it? I mean, I think that comes back to Cliff's question that we really don't know. And we, as you know, and as you rightly pointed out, we are in some sense searching a way to get to that better path.
Yes. So there is no easy answer, of course, to the question. First of all, you said to reach a new equilibrium. We will never reach an equilibrium, because this is like the three-pointed problem in physics. There is no equilibrium. Things will always keep changing. But we have to make choices about the process of change that we want. So if we want to live in democracies where everybody has a voice, and those who disagree with us have as much right to their voice as we do, if we believe in that, then the process of change is slow and messy. We just have to accept that. It is not going to happen quickly. It cannot, because the governance structure of a democracy is inherent in a democracy, that you have to give voice to everybody, and that battle of ideas has to play out over a period. So the danger, I think, or well, maybe not the danger, I won't make value judgments, but the implication of things are too important, or my perspective is too important to wait for the democratic process because it is urgent. What are the implications of taking that line? One implication is violent revolution, because that's always how things have gone in the past. Okay, that people say enough is enough, the system isn't working, let's tear it down. And remember, revolution starts with the idea of creating a new system. But revolutions never go like that. Revolutions essentially end up tearing things down, and then it takes 20 years, 30 years to build something else. So one route is revolution. The other route is authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is always attractive to those people who believe that they can find an authoritarian leader who shares their particular point of view. So if I can find, if one is worried about climate change, and I can find a climate evangelist who is going to seize power, concentrate that power in himself or herself, and push forward the climate agenda, then that becomes attractive. But do we want that? But essentially, Sunil, those are the choices we have. The messy, slow, chaotic process of democracy, violent revolution with the utopic idea that we will immediately create a better system, and that has never happened before, or a march towards some form of authoritarian control that imposes change. Now, I'll leave the choice to you.
Wow. It's been a remarkably thought-provoking conversation, Joe. It really has been. Do you think there's a danger of violent revolution?
There's always a danger of violent revolution. But, revolution, people don't like revolutions. Because,
look at America and Trump.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, people don't like revolutions. I mean, I don't think we need to give it more importance than it deserves. It wasn't a revolution. It was a minor uprising for a few days. People don't like revolution because it's painful. It's violent. People don't like it. So revolutions happen when the sense of hopelessness among the citizenry is so deep that they don't see any other alternative.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're anywhere near that in the West. I mean, most people are still relatively comfortable, doing okay. Okay, there are many people who are not, but the general feeling is not. I think if we talk about revolution in the traditional sense, like the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, etc. But I think we are seeing a kind of revolutionary spirit trying to drive change. So you do see people who say, you know, this isn't working and I want to tear it down. And then let's not worry about what comes next. And radical ideas come out of that. So there is a positive energy that emerges from that kind of revolutionary spirit rather than revolution on the ground. So we need that, and we need people to be discontented enough that they're willing to walk for 5 hours in a march or whatever. You know, we kind of need that. That's a revolutionary spirit, but it's not revolution.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. We'll be closing up shortly, but just before we do, can we just check whether there's anything that anybody else would like to say before I bring the session to a close? Ruth, please do, Ruth. If you can turn your camera on, that would be good. If you can't for some reason, that's okay. But Ruth, please start off by introducing yourself and then make your point. Thank you.
Hi, so I'll be very, very quick. My name's Ruth McDonald. I work with a lot of clients in the pensions industry. Just going back to the comment you made previously, Joe, to one of the questions, and just to say I've really enjoyed the session. It's been really fascinating. You made a point that in the 70s and 80s, everyone was very content with the system. Everyone was doing very well. I'd very strongly want to challenge that. I think, you know, women couldn't apply for a credit card without a man's signature. You had apartheid, all of these kind of horrible things that are going on. And I think a lot of the change that's happening now potentially could be joined back to an increase in equality. You know, you mentioned social media giving more voices. And I think a lot of the points that you've made would be very interesting to look at from that perspective of whether, yeah, there is an unfair disadvantage for certain groups relative to greater living conditions for other people.
So, I mean, you're right, of course. And the 70s were very different from the 80s and the 90s. You know, I think the 80s and the 90s were a kind of almost like the 1920s. You know, there was this kind of spirit of everybody was making a ton of money, etc. But, you know, again, we should try and improve a lot of things, and we keep trying to improve a lot of things. But let's not get carried away. In any society, in any structure, there will be people who are less advantaged than others. That is never, ever going to change, ever. Okay? You describe me one system, one human system anywhere in the world at scale that doesn't have that. Okay? The idea was that communism was supposed to get rid of that. In fact, it entrenched it. So you're right, and we should keep improving people's lot, and we should try and keep you know, look at people who are disadvantaged and help them, and try to modify the system so that their lives are better. But it's not going to go away ever. It just isn't. So, you know, let's be real. It doesn't mean we stop trying, but let's have realistic expectations, because we live in a human system, and humans develop hierarchies in any structure. Humans develop hierarchies, and some people are more privileged than others in those hierarchies. It's only the mechanism of the hierarchy and by which way people are more privileged than others that varies from society to society. But it's the same everywhere, under every system. So again, I think it's not the search for perfection is futile. The question is, which imperfections do you prefer? That's the question we should be asking ourselves. And because life is imperfect, and we're all human beings, and our society is made of human beings, and therefore it'll be imperfect almost by definition. So you know, let's sort of try and balance things out. And you know, I mean, if you look at women's situation, I mean, the situation of women today, thankfully, is on a different planet from what it was 100 years ago. Okay, it's been too slow, fine. It's still not right, agreed. But look at the progress that has been made. And, you know, we're on a trajectory that I think is positive. Now, can we accelerate it? Maybe. And if we can, maybe we should. You know, if we can accelerate these things, then we should. But we are moving broadly in the right direction. Let's at least be thankful for that. Now, it doesn't mean we don't fight for more. It doesn't mean that we don't point out where things are not working. It doesn't mean that if we have ideas of how we can make things better that are practicable rather than pie in the sky, that we don't put them forward. And we also need some anger, because anger is a motivator. But if we only have anger, it doesn't get us anywhere. So, you know, it's all a question of balance.
Joe, thank you very, very much. On behalf of everybody who's had the pleasure of listening to you speak and explain your ideas, it's been a really, really great session, Joe. Can we please show our appreciation, folks? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I put the link to Joe's book in the chat. There's clearly a treasure chest of insightfulness and ideas within it. For me personally, there's something you said that really chimed with me. The idea that there's a global struggle for political ideas is back. To me, that sounds like an opportunity. To me, it sounds like there's a void there that's asking to be filled. And if it's going to be filled with something, why don't we try to get it filled with a sense of transparency, of course, okay, a sense of positivity and hopefulness, a sense of reform, an absolute passion to make the world a better place, and to use our collective leadership to drive the change that we all want to see. And Cliff's just put the word in fairness. I couldn't want to support that any more than you have mentioned, Cliff. Thank you very much. We'll wrap it up there, folks. It's been a real pleasure, Joe. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.